In 1812, with food prices in Britain at their peak, the Luddite movement, until now confined to the Midlands, came to the West Riding. In 1812, the Luddites launched two attacks, one in Horbury on the 9th of April, the other on Rawfolds Mill on the 11th. The attack on Rawfolds Mill was a resounding failure. The Luddites were repelled by the mill's defenders some 20 minutes after the assault began. They left behind them 2 mortally wounded men, but took with them many injured. They made their way along Primrose Lane to the Shears Inn at Hightown. There are numerous theories as to what happened next. Reverend Van der Valk of Hartshead Church offers one explanation.
A story is told by the Reverend Thomas Atkinson, who was the vicar after Patrick Bronte, that one night in April 1812, as Patrick was going home late at night in the dark, a makeshift funeral was taking place in the churchyard just to the right of the church gates. Patrick originally, as he was walking past, thought that some people were desecrating the churchyard, and so he approached with a stick to chase them off. But he realised that what in fact was taking place was the burial of some of the Luddites who died a little later after the battle which had taken place at Rawfolds Mill on April the 11th, 1812. And so Patrick Bronte allowed the makeshift funeral to take place and went away on his way home.
Since the tragic days of April 1812, Rawfolds Mill has undergone many structural alterations. All that remains today are 4 lonely walls. The Black Bull at Birstall, with its first-floor courtroom, was used by the circuit judges of the time. It's said to have housed the preliminary trials of those who were subsequently tried and hanged at York.
Spring him up! Spring him up! And be quiet. What's this? What am I here for? Come on!
Go find out, Robertson!
Why are we here for a start off? It's all in the legal government, it doesn't really matter. Because you're not fit to try me anyway. I'm a man of the Lord. I'm a man of the Lord, and the Lord will provide for me, I'll tell you. There's no problem whatsoever with that one. But why was I at Cartwright's Mill? You, George Miller, should know. I was there looking after your benefits and looking after your interests. And I tell you, Cartwright knew you were going to attack. And I didn't tell him. He spoke the truth. I'm telling you.
Are you trying to say something here, Robertson?
Oh, I certainly am. Certainly am.
Condemned! You stand condemned, Robertson!
Darker rumours suggest that 2 unknown and unnamed Luddites were secretly tried and executed at the block which stood near the pond. Could these be the 2 who Patrick Bronte saw being buried? In addition to the textile industry, Dewsbury and the heavy woolen district had a thriving mining industry. One of these pits was Coombe Hill, which became particularly famous following the 1893 disaster which claimed the lives of 143 men and boys.
Directly underneath where I'm stood is the shaft where on July 4th, 1893, an explosion occurred. What happened was, on that morning, 147 men and boys went down this shaft. By about 12 o'clock, the pit had stopped, the men had stopped for the lunch break. When the people here at the surface heard what they thought was a sound like thunder, they came out of their cabins just to look. Then another explosion occurred and there was smoke coming out of the shaft. They immediately went and got the manager, and it was apparent that something awful had happened underground. They did make an attempt to get down this shaft, but they got part way down, and when they got about 75 yards down, they heard what they described as a noise like a blast furnace. So they came back to the surface. Then they had to go down the other shaft, which was over there. They got down there, but they were confronted by a lot of methane and smoke, and they came back to the surface. They made several attempts that day to get down, but of no avail, and it wasn't till the following morning that they did get down the pit. And when the methane had cleared from the pit bottom, and a search of the mine was made, and of the 147 men and boys who went down that day, they found 7 survivors. But what had happened was that an explosion had actually occurred in the shaft, and it caused a fire to a wood platform in this shaft, and all the smoke from this fire went into the workings and just suffocated the poor men, and they'd no way of getting out. And they said they were either suffocated by smoke or by methane. This colliery then carried on producing coal till 1972, and soon after that the site was taken over by the local authority. We can still see the old winding house for the Black Bed shaft and a ventilation pipe coming out of what was then the main shaft. Both my father and myself worked at this colliery, but in the 1893 disaster, my grandfather, that's my father's father, and his 2 brothers were lost on that day. The lads were aged 13 and 15.
The 19th century saw the beginning of the railway era, and at its height, Dewsbury had 3 separate lines running through it: the Lancashire and Yorkshire, the London and North Western, and the Great Northern. The lines serve many stations which sadly no longer exist, but the district's greatest prosperity followed the opening of these lines. The canals too lost ground to modern road and rail transport. The Cauldron-Hebble navigation and the Leeds-Liverpool canals are still operative, but the traffic today tends to be holidaymakers and those who live on the many narrowboats which still line the marina at Mirfield. As well as being the centre of the heavy woolen industry, Dewsbury has other claims to fame. Many famous men and women were born in the town. An acknowledged expert on this subject is Margaret Watson, assistant editor at the Dewsbury Reporter, who's compiled the Dewsbury Greats exhibition.
That my parents would tell me about. Quite a lot of these people lived very near to me, went to the same school. Some of them went to the same pubs as my father, worked with my parents, and when most children were probably listening to radio or doing their own work, I was listening to the stories that my parents told me about these people. Tommy Weston, the famous jockey who won the Derby twice on Hyperion and Sansovino. And then, of course, Bert Lee, who wrote Knees Up Mother Brown, a very, very famous songwriter. And, of course, people like Baroness Lockwood, Betty Boothroyd, Sir Marcus Fox, Eddie Waring. And what is quite remarkable about these 4, that they all went to the same school, DEWSBURY School, which is just a few yards from where we are now. And really, I would say that is quite unique, particularly Betty Boothroyd, Speaker in the House of Commons, and Baroness Lockwood, Deputy Speaker in the House of Lords. And actually, as a journalist, I became fascinated in the lives of these people, because each one of them you could write a book about. When I started doing the research, I found that here was the stuff that Hollywood movies were made of. There were heroes, heroines. We had 2 brave soldiers who were awarded the VC for outstanding courage, Private Horace Waller and Sergeant John Willie Ormsby. And I remember as a child Sergeant Ormsby coming to our house and pinning the VC onto me and actually saying to me, "One day, Margaret, you will tell the world about this." And strangely, I hope I am through this.
Hartshead Church is particularly renowned for its connection with both Patrick Bronte and the Luddites. Patrick Bronte, the famous author and father of daughters who were famous authors, was the curate here between 1811 and 1815. And Patrick originally came here from Dewsbury, and whilst he was here, he wrote his own first book, the Cottage Poems, published in 1811. He also met and married his wife, Maria, whilst he was at Hartshead Church, and at that time Patrick was lodging at Thornbush Farm, and then Patrick and his wife Maria moved to the house at the end of Clough Lane on what's now Halifax Road in Hightown, where they brought up their first two children, Elizabeth and Maria, both of which died at the age of 10 and 12.
Far from being rooted in the past, Dewsbury and the heavy woolen district are still growing, expanding and changing.